Today we're pleased to present Dean Fred Poston over here. So as Dean of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, Fred Poston leads the Agriculture and Natural Resources research, teaching, and outreach programs for Michigan State University. Working collaboratively with MSU Ag Bio Research and MSU Extension, Dean Poston works to advance Michigan's rich agriculture and natural resources sector, educate future leaders, and lead faculty and staff in solving some of Michigan's greatest problems. Poston served as Vice President for the Finance and Operations for Michigan State University from 1999 to his appointment as Dean 2013. Before his appointment as Vice President, Poston also served as the CANR Dean for 8 years from 1991 to 1998. And in his time as Dean, Poston guided the revitalization of the Michigan Animal Agriculture Initiative, created Project Green. Sorry, there's an extra E I didn't know.
I didn't
and developed the Partnership for Ecosystem Research and Management between MSU and Michigan Department of Natural Resources, involving partners including the MDNR's Forest Management Division and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and the United States Geological Survey. So with that, we're pleased to present Dean Poston as our Simmons speaker for this year. Thank you.
Well, that's a nice introduction, and thank you, but we all know the reality of it is there are armies of people involved in doing all of those things that they put my name at the head of. So, and if some of you were engaged in it, I haven't forgotten, so for what it's worth. When the students asked me to do this, my first inclination was to say no, because I thought, well, it's going to be on the top of everything else. But the students asked me to do it, and if Miller had called or somebody, I'd have said, hell no, I'm not going to do that. But since it was the students, I said I would. And then when I saw the topic, I was thinking, God, you know, I've given countless numbers of talks over all of these years, but I never had to stand up in front of a group of people and talk about myself. And the thought of that seemed really awkward. So I'm not sure how this is going to come out. I hope I don't embarrass myself in the process, but nonetheless, I thought about some of the administrative things I could talk about. Usually when people outline what's happened after one of these great exercises, it all gets sifted and sorted, and it sounds, you know, a whole lot better planned and executed than the reality of it was, which is usually chaos and pandemonium. Okay, and so I thought as I went, I might share some of that pandemonium with you as we go through this. I grew up in a military family. My father, when he retired, was a lieutenant general in the Air Force. My grandfather was a farmer, and so I was split in the summers between wherever we were in the world on a military base, and I went to the farm to work for my grandfather every summer, which was a unique experience. My cousins used to complain about working for their fathers. I said, well, hell, you ought to try working for your grandfather. So I grew up that way. My grandparents, it was interesting when I think back about that farm, because they were as close to subsistence farmers as anybody I've ever run across. I mean, they produced almost everything that they ate. And I can remember as a boy going to the grocery store with my grandmother. It must have been every 2 or 3 weeks. She would buy sort of one bag of groceries, come home, complain all the way home about what the things cost and what she had to buy as we went through that. And I think about when we go to the grocery store nowadays, I'm about as far away from that as you can get. So I floated along and through the normal sort of youthful experiences of grade schools and various things. And about my junior year in high school, I found myself in military school. Now this occurred after, I have a first cousin that's the same age I am, and we grew up like brothers, and he was very adept at pool playing. And I was quite a bit bigger than the average bear. I was pretty decent at thumping people if it was required. And we would go to the pool hall, and he would win, some cash, and the police showed up one day and we got ourselves in trouble. Now, my family was a matriarchal family, and we had a great aunt that really ran everything. My cousin and I used to talk about, justice wasn't always just, but it was absolutely swift, okay? And so very shortly after this altercation, I found myself in military school. He was in Catholic boarding school. After I listened to the stories of the nuns, I was pretty sure I got the better deal. He still has a hard time closing his hand, actually. So, in my defense, though, trouble in those days was very different than it is today. And in my family, roller rinks and pool halls were dens of iniquity. So even going into one, much less having the police escort you home, was a major infraction. So I went through military school, and after graduation, I found myself in college. And I didn't particularly want to go to college, I don't think. But the alternative was become cannon fodder in Vietnam. And even I figured, hey, I think I'll try college first. Okay? So I enrolled, and after a pretty steady diet of girls and beer for about 2 semesters, I got a letter from the college that said, my services were no longer appreciated.
What college was this?
The University of South Florida. And so I was booted out. My father still tells people that I majored in good time and I graduated early. You'd have to know my father, he has a very limited sense of humor, so he doesn't say that with great humor still. There stood Uncle Sam, his arms wide open, say, we'll take you, we love you. Okay. So I joined the Air Force. I remember I went through 3 days worth of tests. And God, it took forever to go through all these tests. And when I finished this, they said, well, you have an affinity in mathematics and science, but you're one of the most dreadful people with languages we've ever met. The math and the science was a bit of a surprise. The language was not a surprise to me. So they shipped me off to this top secret school where I learned how to repair cryptographic computers. Now remember, I didn't particularly want to go to school at this stage of my life. So we got out of it after about 10 months, and we got assigned to the maintenance shop in the school. There were 49 other people in there, and the guy running the thing says, well, we don't really need you right now, and turned around and enrolled us in another school. And every time we would get finished, he would enroll us in another school. So for a chap that didn't want to college, I went to class every day for 2.5 years out of this. However, we finally finished the last school possible. We had learned how to fix everything. And the Tet Offensive occurred. And they shipped 49 people to Vietnam and left the 2 of us and a sergeant because we knew how to repair everything. And I was a little slow on the value of education, but it finally dawned on me of what the value of that education was worth in the whole process. Left the Air Force armed with a GI Bill and a desire to learn something. I was married by this time. My wife was a school teacher. And so I was enrolled in college, and I spent a semester looking around, seeing what I might want to do. And I remember the next semester, my father-in-law was a very down-to-earth farmer, not a man of a great many words. And we were sitting on the porch one evening, and he said, by the way, he said, I've been kind of wondering, just what is it that you plan to do to support my daughter? And in that instant, it was a life-altering experience. It focused my attention. I said, looking is over. I knew that I liked biology, I liked entomology specifically, I liked ecology, and I liked agriculture. I assumed from working on that farm all that time. So I moved through, graduated from West Texas State University at that time with a degree in biology and a minor in chemistry. I worked for a fellow that shipped a bunch of us off to Iowa State, and I went up to Iowa State with Larry Pedigo. And let me catch up with myself here. That was a really, for me, and I suspect for most of us, it was really a growth experience. And I hadn't been exposed to that many possibilities in entomology, much less the other areas you could get into. I was really fond of research as soon as I came across that, enjoyed it. I found that I really enjoyed the statistical work. Iowa State in those days was really kind of a mecca for statisticians. And all of us that went through the department, they made sure we were well versed in the fundamentals of statistics, which when I got to my next assignment was what qualified me to be the statistics consultant in the department, because nobody else even ever had a course, okay? So it was a little out of date. And so I moved through that process, and I really became interested in insect defoliation and its effects on plants. It was the obvious in terms of actual defoliation, but what else was going on while that insect was munching away? Did it affect photosynthesis? Did it affect, what else did it affect? And so I found myself with a bunch of plant physiology graduate students, and I was lapping up some of that information and knowledge, and we were testing all of that stuff in the field. And I think back about that. We were using radioactive carbon isotopes, and after you got finished with it, you just opened it up, and which we don't do that anymore. But at the time, I didn't think anything about it. Graduated, joined the faculty at Kansas State University, and everybody else was older. I was the only assistant professor that hadn't achieved tenure in the department. I felt like sort of the grandchild in the operation. Of course, I probably had a full dose of arrogance to go along with it, so I probably didn't help myself in that process. But I was assigned to work on southwestern corn borer, which was a nasty little critter that had driven Kansas corn farmers out of production twice since the 1940s. And it lays eggs. There's 2 generations a year, lays eggs on the leaves, and the first or second instar will bore into the plant, in which case, you can't get to it anymore. And then as the season progresses, just before, you're going to harvest it, it burrows its way or bores its way down to the bottom of the stalk and girdles the inside of the stalk. So the first breeze that comes along, the stalk falls over. And you could ride along the road and there'd be whole cornfields laying there. Needless to say, this sent most corn farmers into the stratosphere of complaints. And they wanted something done about this. So I was hired to develop a management strategy for all of this. The experiment station director was out of town when I was interviewing. So I showed up, and about 2 weeks after I was there, I got this phone call, and his name was Floyd Smith, and he looked like this bulldog, not friendly looking at all or inviting. And he wanted me in his office, his secretary said, front and center. So I said, okay. I showed up, and you went in, and it was all old discarded World War II furniture, and and just, he was a strange character. And he looked at me and said, I just wanted to tell you that if you hadn't made satisfactory progress with this problem in the first year, there's going to be a vacancy. I said, do you understand that? I thought about that for a minute. I thought that was pretty self-explanatory. And I said, yes, sir, I understand. But I was motivated, I have to admit, when I left that place. So we started down the list looking at resistant varieties. Even the pesticides were not effective. The ones that they either had no effect or they also caused other problems like spider mite problems and a classical sort of entomological cascade that you had to contend with. So, as it turned out, and there were no lines that we could identify. We worked with USDA breeders. Nothing we could find that had any resistance to it. So there was a new class of materials, the pyrethroids that had come out. And lo and behold, they were very sensitive to the pyrethroids. But they didn't last all that long. And so the trick was putting it on there at just the right time before that larva bored into the stalk. And of course, to make the problem a bit more complex, it didn't happen at the same time of year, and the length of egg laying period changed, and the density obviously, and the rest of it. So we had at the time what seemed like a substantial predictive problem. About that time, we hired a young systems scientist, Steve Welch, which some of you know. I know Seward does, and our vintage, and he was trained at MSU and actually worked on some entomology projects. And he showed up, and he carried with him a sort of a phenology model, Pete it was called, I believe at the time. I can't remember what that stood for. And but you did a bunch of work with insects and looked at their life cycles and their development rates and the rest, and you could predict how they progressed through that whole process to adults and would lay eggs. And we developed an economic injury level finally. This is after years of working with this stuff and a series of other things. And we found if you augmented all of this with samples out of the first generation, you could pretty accurately predict when the second generation moths were going to fly and when they were going to lay eggs. And when we got that far, lo and behold, we had an effective management strategy. I wasn't real happy with it because you could still get spider mite problems occasionally, but it was better than nothing. And we were off looking at biologics and all sorts of different things, trying to find some sort of alternatives to go with this. In the midst of all of this, well, I should say the experiment station director was happy at that point, and he was no longer talking about firing me. In the midst of all of this, some of you might remember Dick Sauer, who was one of Dean Haynes' graduate students, but I think at North Dakota. By this time, he was chair at Kansas State University. And he kept talking to me about taking a sabbatical and going to Washington, D.C. And, Steve Welch and I, by this time, we'd just combined all of our research projects, and we were going gangbusters. And I could not, for the life of me, figure out why I would want to go to Washington, D.C. in the midst of all of this. But he was persistent. And he finally convinced me that if I spent the year in Washington, D.C., and I really got to know how the grants programs worked and the rest of it, I could feather my own nest, which appealed to me. So I did it. What he really wanted was he wanted me to have administrative experience, which he neglected to tell me, naturally, in the process. And it turned out to be really a quite wonderful comparative course in administration. I chaired reviews, departmental reviews. In fact, one of them was here in 1980, and which I won't really share the details with, but it was a little wild and woolly in those days with Haynes and some of the others that were here. But I also worked in a lot of different federal agencies, worked off the President's Council of Environmental Quality, did a whole lot of work with the federal budget, went to some of the hearings and watched Jamie Whitten tear the arms and legs off of USDA people that were testifying. I was glad I wasn't in there. And came home, and I carried a federal appointment with me, a partial appointment, working on damage assessment across the nation. I had been back to Kansas quite a bit, and Welch and I talked constantly. The pest management arena by then was getting pretty crowded with people of all sorts of different types. And they were having all sorts of interesting arguments about what the hell is pest management and what is and what isn't. And that seemed sort of vacuous to me. So we started saying, well, what's coming after this? What are we going to do in the future? And everybody's looking at pest management. Not too many people were looking at the crop level. So we began to do work with that. And when we looked at this, we ended up with a different approach. I was intrigued by the fact that if you talk to farmers that produce, say, corn in different geographic areas, the management decisions they had to make frequently would be different. And as you sort of plotted some of those and looked across it, you began to realize that there were degrees of similarity in various areas and dissimilarity. And it made it a whole lot easier if you used that as some sort of a divider versus trying to figure out something with ecosystems where mostly you never can tell where one starts and the other one finishes. So we used that. Wasn't perfect, but it worked for us at the time. And a software program that we worked on, the Pro Series, started. And this was basically, Welch had designed a software shell, and we could connect all these modules that interacted with one another. So we embedded management decisions in those different modules. And this was going gangbusters. I remember we got a big grant from Kellogg Foundation, started it off, and as if you've ever had the experience of moving into a new area, it got to be quite popular for a while, and we had grants going like crazy. And after about 2 years of this, I realized one afternoon that all I was doing was administration. I was writing grant proposals, writing reports, managing people, managing budgets, and the rest of it. And I thought, well, I guess I'm already over halfway there. Sauer was telling me I should apply for some administrative jobs, so I did. There was an associate director of the experiment station job at MSU open that I applied for, and when the extension director at K-State found out that I was applying, he started lobbying me to fill the associate director position at K-State. Now, there's a recurring theme I'm going to mention here in my career as I did this. I pretty well knew what the experiment station situation was, but I really didn't know that much about extension. And so he kept talking to me about it, and I found it intriguing. So I took it, even though it wasn't in my career plan. And it was a huge growth experience for me, and I had a great time working with all of those folks and learned a tremendous amount. The subject matter alone that you had to master just increased exponentially. I was thrown in the deep end of the political pool with the legislature, and I found that I actually had some capabilities working with them. You might want to go home and throw up afterwards, but basically, I could stand it for a while. Fred Sobering, who was an ag economist, was a director at that time. And every afternoon for about the first 6 months, from about 4:30 to 6, I would be in his office. And he would start an argument, a professional argument. And he was very adept at arguing. And after a few months of this, I began to realize that, well, no matter what happened to me as Associate Director of Extension, it was going to be better than arguing with Fred Sobering. And what he was really doing was mentoring me into the mindset that I had to have to be able to make it through this. Well, he got some medical problems developed, and he had to retire. Walt Woods had come along, decided he was going to be Dean, Director, and Director, which I was still Associate Director. And then he said, and you're running the Extension Service. So all of a sudden, I was at the helm on the ship, and that was a little sobering for a while, but made it okay. I was moving along, and we were doing some interesting things, and Gordon Geyer called me up on the phone. Now, I'd had a long relationship with Geyer from the time I was at the Ent meetings looking for a graduate school and ran into Geyer. First thing, bought a friend of mine and I dinner, explained all of it to me. So when I went to apply, I applied to work under him. And he never answered me. As I'm fond of telling people, if he'd answered me, I might have been his graduate student. He tells people I wasn't qualified, so to be fair. So he was talking to me about this. He was director through that period of time of extension. And all of a sudden I was an associate director, but I had to meet with the directors because I was running it. And he advised me, he says, you know, you don't want to stay in that associate director position too long, you'll get stuck. So I was coming up on 3 years, and I got a phone call from Jim Osmond at Washington State. He'd been associate director of the experiment station at K-State. And he had a director's job open and invited me to apply. I'd never seen Washington State. It wasn't quite what I thought I was going to be doing for the next stop, but what the hell sounded intriguing, so I did it. Okay. So now I'm in Washington State, director. It was a wonderful place with a very unusual place. Politically very unusual. The behavior of the farmers you dealt with was very different. You know, in the Midwest, you've got the typical farmer, you know, you have some unpalatable practice that has to change, and you can sit down usually and talk to them for a while, and eventually they say, well, I don't like it, but I guess I'm going to have to do it. Well, what was right in Washington was whatever the grower wanted to do, and there was no compromise, which made conversations about that really interesting. In fact, when I left, I thought about putting a sticker on the back of my car that said, I survived the spotted owl on the way out. That was really a horrible experience. It had no redeeming qualities, and the whole thing was ridiculous from the beginning. You had all these people fighting about taking their livelihood away, and they basically already harvested about almost 99% of the old growth forest. And the next year or two, they were going to go out of business because there wasn't anything left to cut down. Okay, and all of this fight was going on because of this. And I won't delve into it, but it was really nasty. In fact, what they had teed up was a big fight between the power companies, the Indian reservations, which by treaty they had rights to certain stream flows during special times of the year, and salmon runs. And I said, we're going to have a big fight. And the Aggies all had various water rights for irrigation off of this. So I decided it was really a good time to depart the sunny state of Washington. Geyer had called me on the phone and urged me to apply for the dean's job here. By this time, I think he was in his third or fourth reincarnation as the vice president for governmental affairs, having already run the DNR and I don't remember what all the hell he ran through all of that. And he said, you need to apply for this. I said, well, they don't hire extension directors to be deans. You know, they're all experiment station. No, you got to do this, you got to do this. So I thought, well, okay, hell, it'll be a hoot. So I applied, and son of a gun, I got an interview. Next thing I knew, I had a job offer. I said, well, I guess we're going to Michigan. And we departed. I also had, at the same time, exactly the same job offer from Colorado State University, which isn't the university that Michigan State is. But what it did have, I had two daughters that loved to ski. And as we drove through Colorado, the two smart alecks in the back kept saying, now tell me again, Dad, why we're moving to Michigan. You know, and I was hearing all these things like, it's vanilla, you know, it's boring, it's flat, okay? And you go through all this stuff as your children can do. But I moved here, and it was really a great time to move to Michigan State because actually we had a large portion of the faculty and the commodity groups were in agreement, and the legislature. And the governor was a graduate of the college, and the key legislators, the chair of Senate Appropriations was a graduate, and there were a lot of the Aggies were really very influential in all of this. And I kept thinking, God, when's the next time those planets are going to line up? This looked like a pretty good opportunity. And I had always been intrigued by different approaches to raising funding packages for the university, specifically Extension and Experiment Station. So I'd been through this drill in 2 other states where you'd usually start with some legislator and you'd compromise your way through all this thing. Time you got to the end, there wasn't anything left, and somebody would usually railroad it out of the funding stream. Really, a lot of work, no results kind of an approach. And I could not understand why we couldn't run grassroots kinds of campaigns with Experiment Station and Extension in that. When I got here, the animal groups had put together a package called the Animal Initiative. I wasn't real fond of it, but it was high-centered in the legislature. And so, they wanted help getting it out. So we backed up and we started a grassroots process. And we had people march in, do the whole drill. It just slid right through there. So the next was the plant folks. And so we had a chance then to really design something that we thought was going to be, that would serve the university well for the future and our faculty. And I won't go through how we changed all of it, but at any rate, we started off with about $5 or $6 million. And I well remember being in a senator's office, and the senator was saying, now, gee whiz, Dean Poston, $6 million, that's a lot of money. He said, couldn't you get by with $1 million? I remember saying, Senator, I probably could, but I'm not real sure what I'd tell the voters in your district. And that was the end of the conversation. He voted for that, by the way. He was supportive of it as we went through. We had Project Green. I think of all the kinds of funding projects I've ever heard of, that's been one of the most successful in the country. It's still there. The money is still there. They never cut it. When I came back in the job this time, they used it as an example of how they wanted to run all these other projects. I was really sort of amazed. Most of them didn't fit that model, but at any rate. So we still had that money and we were moving. I still think that grassroots approach is a relevant approach. I did try it a 3rd time, and John Engler said, you've had enough, and he sidetracked it, and he was a lot cagier than I realized. So I eased along in this, and I told the faculty I was only going to serve 8 years, because I firmly believed that you would get these folks in, they'd sit in a dean's job for 15 or 20 years, and everybody was just stagnant. And they'd run out of new ideas so long back, nobody could even remember what one looked at. And when you do that, there's this natural evolution of ideas that come along, and the decisions you make either advance or suppress somebody's ideas. If you change periodically, at least you've got the opportunity for somebody to win that wouldn't have it. And it's astounding what happens when they win and you were wrong and they were right, okay? So I really firmly believe that I should be out of that by 8 years. And I was looking at Stuart. I remember at the time we were good friends, and he kept saying, well, you ought to come back and work with me in this lab. And he and Skoll and those guys, they had more grant money than they knew what to do with. And I thought, well, I could enjoy this. This would be good. And then McPherson called me on the phone. I was home with the flu, laying in the bed, told the secretary, I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm in between running back and forth to the commode, and the phone rings, and it's Peter McPherson. I just want to talk to you for 1 minute, for an hour and a half. That's usually where those went. And we had hired Mark Murray to take over from Roger Wilkinson to be the vice president for finance and operations. And Mark, we'd pulled him out of state government, and the governor turned around and hired him back after he'd been here 6 months. He says, I just need you to do this for 6 months while I hire somebody else. So I thought about this for a while. I thought, well, hell, I really don't know anything about doing this. This ought to be a real hoot. After all, how bad could you screw it all up in 6 months? Okay, in the whole thing. It looked intriguing, so I think I'll do that. Okay. Again, I altered my career plan in the process.
What medication were you on right then?
No, this is the astounding part. I wasn't on any. That was, something always came along that looked better as we went through this. And I thought, well, in 6 months I'll be over there with those guys and this will work out. After about 4 months, I noticed McPherson wasn't doing anything. There was no search committee. There was no discussion. I started talking to him and he says, well, you're doing such a great job. We want you to stay. And I said, well, I'm an academic. This is the non-academic part of the university. I don't have any business over here. Never had an accounting course in my life. Okay, and responsible for a $2 billion budget. I said, when the external auditors show up, they're going to laugh you into the grave. No, you do this. So after 2 years of arguing, I agreed to do it on a permanent basis. And it was difficult to win an argument with Peter. And so I was working with Luana. I knew Luana. A lot of people have trouble working with Luana. I could do it, and so we were buzzing along in that whole thing. And so I had, by this time I had survived because administratively I'd always been a delegator, not a micromanager. So it's always enabled me to have the time to play with the big pieces and have other people that actually knew what they were doing play with the pieces that counted, okay? And so, every job I've had, I pull all of the administrators in with me and say, now the first thing I'm going to tell you is I don't know anything about doing this job. And everybody sucks in their breath at that point. But I said, I don't really have to, I have you. And I want you to know when there's a problem in one of the things, your units, you have a problem. I don't have a problem. You have a problem. You don't solve it, I have a problem. Do we understand each other? It's amazing. I've only had to get rid of a few people over the years that didn't understand that. And people work better in that environment. All of a sudden, you unleash their creativity instead of me sitting around making all the decisions. And what I found over the years, to be honest about it, 9 times out of 10, they'll do a better job than I would have anyway in the whole thing. So we buzzed along with that. We went through, all of a sudden now, I am responsible for, as I said, a huge budget, 10,000 people, 50,000 students, the police, athletics, all the finances and investments, of which I was a great expert, the physical plant, I've forgotten all the stuff, but everything that's non-academic, okay, in the whole shebang. And we set about organizing that and working with it. And it was very rewarding. I used my modeling background and experience we started developing predictive models for things, for everything from maintenance needs to when we should let bonds and people sat over and looked kind of astounded that you would do this. I said, well, what have you been doing? Okay, with all this? Well, we don't do that. I said, well, so we got where we could predict what the rating agencies were going to give us for a rating, which would be how much money it cost us to borrow money. And we could calculate that and decide whether we wanted to borrow or not in the process and decide the length of time. And we could manage then the maturity dates on our bonds as we went through so we didn't overtax ourselves. And we developed a campus master plan and all sorts of smaller models that attached off of that. And so we went through that and just had quite a ball. I even got Stuart and some of his people to help us establish a GIS system for the campus. It's kind of nice to know where something is before you start digging a hole, because usually bad things happen if you do that. So we were humming through that, and I had a great time doing it. But I was also on the hook 24/7. I was the vice president, was almost always here. I was the one that was wired up to the campus, literally. I'd go on vacation and just drive my wife insane. It got to the point where I'd wait until she got in the shower and I'd pull my computer out to work on it. She knew what I was doing, but nonetheless, it's a big stress to do that. And 14 years of that is a long time. But it went so fast that I was just sort of there at the end of it, lickety-split. I didn't really realize how tired I was of it until I got out of doing it. But I enjoyed that, and I decided I was going to retire within about a year and join all the old duffers over at Carl Gabriel's and yell out, "It was running okay when I left it." You know, that's my approach. You know, you guys screwed it up, not us. So there's a whole group of them over there on Wednesdays. I get a big kick out of them. In the process. And so I thought, well, I'll just finish out my career and retire. I'd already been through the wars with athletics. I had to run. I wasn't even a fan, okay, and I was responsible for it. I had no background in athletics. A good friend of mine was Clarence Underwood, who he subsequently made AD. I'd exercise with him every morning at 5:30, and we'd do, 101 college athletics, which is it's a different universe. You just I never understood that anything like that went on. And it was nothing to brag about. The only thing Clarence could say was, well, we weren't as dirty as all the other Big Ten universities. I thought, my God, if we were doing this, what in the world were they doing? Okay, so Luana came along as president, and she loves athletics. She wanted it. It was a good day. She took it. So I'm buzzing along here thinking I'm going to retire, and I started getting phone calls from some of the ag leaders in the state who are really mad. And I got calls from some of the faculty in the college, and they were super mad in the whole thing. And then I started getting calls from legislators who were very specific about what they expected me to do about it, and which I didn't have anything I could do about it. And lo and behold, we had managed to work ourselves into what appeared to be a real fine mess. It wasn't nearly as bad as it looked like or it sounded once you got everybody calmed down and they could look at rationally at where we were and where we needed to go. But, the rock throwing was starting, and I'd had very good relationships with commodity groups outside, and at least the faculty didn't strangle me while I was dean the first time. And so I found myself in a unique position, I thought, to be able to make some changes and help us get back on track. We'd already had a failed search. I couldn't imagine hiring a new dean in that environment, or anybody wanting whoever we could hire in that environment. And to be honest about it, it was kind of a thrill, because it was sort of like being the old fire horse, and all of a sudden you get to answer the call one more time. Okay? And so I was off and running, and I had cauliflower ear from listening to people scream at me in the phone for the first year. Although now it's very calm, and it's getting rather boring, to be really honest about it. Nobody calls over there now. And so I guess it's probably success. I think we've probably done what I have to offer in it, and if we can find a good dean, we'll be set. I titled this the way I did because a few years back I was talking to my old major prof, and he said, I never could get you to develop a career plan. I said, well, that's not true. I had a career plan. He said, yeah, but you never followed it. I said, because something more intriguing came along. And that pretty well sums up my career. And it's been wonderful for me. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily to anybody else, but for me, it's been great. So, with that, I'd be happy to answer questions. Just soon not talk about my sex life, but other than that, I'll talk to you.
I just had the sexual harassment training course.
You didn't mention the future.
Mention the future?
Mention the future.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is the day after I retire is I'm going to disappear for probably about 6 months. A few people like Stuart and some of my close friends will probably know him. But that's the only way at this place you can get off the hook from somebody calling you up and say, you got to do this, you have to do this, okay, with some compelling reason. You know, about 6 months I figure they'll forget about it and I'll have a clear sailing. I have a ton of things I want to do, and I used to, telling the students some tales, I used to play in bands when I was young. And I had worked my way down into playing in a country and western band in South Texas. It was just like in the movies, with the chicken wire and people throwing beer bottles. And it was it was a real upright establishment. And my wife, or she wasn't my wife at that point, was raised in a fundamentalist church, and her father was a pretty straight arrow, and I really couldn't see how those two paths were going to cross, and so I got sold my way out of that. But he's dead now. And so last year I took up the guitars again, and all of a sudden it went from 1 to 5, and my wife's in there counting. You know, I'm getting lectures about, well, you can't possibly play all of those. I said, sure you can. Just through time, you know, you got to do all that. So, anyway. So I've got a bunch of that stuff. I had a wood shop, and I like to make furniture. If you have 2 married daughters, you never run out of projects. What I found was, the hard way was, is if you decide to make something for the first one, may as well just go ahead and buy the wood to make 2, because you're gonna, I want one of those that way, except I want something else on it. So you have to do that. Keep you busy. Yes, sir.
Fred, do you feel that an entomological background provided anything unique or special that predisposed you to success in administration?
I found being a tactical trained insect killer to be very helpful, actually.
To round out my question, I just wonder if one came from a soil science background or something like that. Whether we entomologists sometimes credit ourselves with being integrative somehow. And I'm asking you from your experience, is that really true or not?
Well, I think it probably depends. I suppose it depends more on the person, Jim. I know Stuart and I and some friends out of that generation, all of us were predisposed to be, to look at sort of larger systems. And rather than being reductionist, being sort of big picture thinkers more as you go through this. And interesting things, I used to have these horrible arguments with engineers who, in a modeling arena, which they would build models and they'd build it one brick at a time. Okay, and they would end up with these monsters, and they'd turn it on and it would eat itself, okay, literally. And the ecologists and the system scientists didn't have really the luxury of being able to do that, because you didn't understand most of what was going on. So you tended to research the pieces that you thought were relevant, add that to the model until you got some reasonable outcome of predictability out of it, and that was good enough. So that served me well as I thought about problems and all these administrative things. I know it probably doesn't sound like they're connected, but they really were. for me anyway. And, you know, by stepping back and letting people do the pieces that they were responsible for, and looking at the bigger picture, you could guide the pieces together so you ended up with something more significant than otherwise. You were just sort of, things were coming out at all sorts of different times, and maybe something eventually would mold together, but it was disjunct, and there were silly things. I mean, McPherson was screaming and yelling because they tore the pavement up in front of his house 4 years in a row. Now, you know, I saw the humor in that, but he didn't. And he was, you know, that blessed physical plant, they can't do anything, right? Well, the way they managed to do that was they had all these disjunct pieces of the thing planning. And so one year they dug it up to put some new tunnels under there or something and wiring. And another year they dug it up for some drainage thing. None of those two were talking to one another. And we just had a terrible time with all of that. So we did. We integrated all of those things. And not everybody was wild about doing that. But we finally got it done and reached the point where they only tore the pavement up once. And then they went and did all those other things. So yeah, I think it did me a good service. I don't know inherently whether entomologists are any bigger thinkers than soil scientists. I mean, I know some soil scientists that were in those groups that we used to interact with that were pretty big.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that your modeling experience really helped you in this process at MSU. We used to have two courses here. The grad student was the system science for biology with Dr. Bob Barr and Stewart, and the other was system analysis and design. What are some of the courses I took during my master's and PhD?
Ah.
And it really helped a lot in putting all the concepts together. You have a program or project, and it's really great. But
Well, the thing I loved about it was it put methodology to that thinking of how to organize things and do that. And I was trained as an ecologist and a statistician. I did a lot of statistical modeling and stuff, but it wasn't until Welch came along that we got into the more systems work. And that was a big growth experience for me also. I found a lot of uses for that. And as Stuart and I used to talk about, the interesting thing about modeling is that so much of it is conceptual. You can arrange the concepts if you have some people that'll work with you that can program it and do all of the other stuff that has to be done. And so you can move through life if you have that kind of organization. So, Fred.
Do you think your military experience was significant in how you approach things?
Well, I didn't really enjoy being in the military, as I recall at the time. Okay, I'm not sure whether it was my father or whether it was the military experience. I still hear his comments in my head sometimes. He was never impressed with PhDs. He'd worked with a lot of PhDs, and he was in the cat herding mode as he thought about us. I used to talk about administration. He'd laugh and, how could you minister something like that? I said, well, totally different than you do. Because where I live, if you give the faculty an order, that's the surest way I know that it won't get done, okay? So you have to develop a different approach to it. So I don't know, Fred, whether it was or not. I went to military school. I was in the military. I was comfortable with it, with the culture, I suppose. And when I ran across the police, they're a paramilitary organization. It was amazing to me how comfortable I became so quickly with them. I think it was because of the pieces. And so, yeah.
How important do you think it is for an upper level administrator to have experience being an actual faculty
Yeah,
Doing the research and teaching that sort of thing.
I think it's critical, of extraordinarily critical, and a whole lot of the problems that I saw were because the people that were in those jobs, it wasn't because they were bad people or dumb people. They didn't have the experience that you're talking about that enabled them to understand the people that they were trying to administer. And, you know, invariably it bites you on the butt. So I was always thankful that I'd made my way up the hill as a faculty member before I found myself in this. Not that I had great understanding per se, but I was certainly initiated, so. Yeah.
I'm thinking of the students now listening to this talk, and I wondered if you
How many administrators you think you're going to get out of that lot?
I wondered if you have any specific guidance with respect to what I hear you talk about. I hear you talked about today background, opportunities, and risks.
Mhm.
It strikes me that you took some significant risks. You know, sometimes as we educators work with students, we oftentimes talk to them about, now you need to become expert on something. You know, maybe you need to control your attention span a little bit so you're not all over the place.
It's kind of
And be
goes along
careful.
with developing a career
Be
plan.
careful
Yeah.
how many risks you take, because maybe you go out there and you can't get back. So I'm sort of asking a little bit of.
Yeah, we were talking about a
what
little
it's like
bit
to
of this.
listen to this from students and saying,
Yeah.
what specifically would you want to tell them
I,
in a nugget?
you know, I think to an extent, you know, everybody has to chart their own course to a large degree. And it's dependent upon your personality, who you are as a person, the experiences that you've had, your willingness to take risk or not take risk, the things that go with that. I don't think there's a one approach that it fits all. To the contrary. We used to train people that way, but it doesn't work. We were talking about risk inadvertently at lunch, and my wife always says, well, you know, I'll walk along till I see a lion with its mouth open, and I just can't bear to not stick my head in a lion's mouth, okay, to see if it bites,
She
okay?
says that about you?
Yeah. She says a lot of other things about me too as we go. So, at any rate, I suppose it's terribly exciting if you can stand the stress. It's a tremendous feeling because I did that a lot, I guess, but I succeeded or I survived or and there was a big thrill associated with that. But after you've done that once or twice, the thrill's gone and I'd lose interest, and I was on to looking for something else. Most often, we were talking at lunch about, well, what happens when a student breezes along trying to make a career path work for them, and it just won't work. They're on the wrong path. They don't have any business being in that, and it becomes evident to the major prof and the student. Can be a devastating experience, okay? Until you live along long enough, and you've lived the way I have, and you realize that, if you just calm down, wait a minute, something else is going to come along that's going to be more interesting in the whole thing, maybe put you on the right path for where you need to be. But, I mean, it's awfully hard when you're young and, you put out that kind of effort, and it just isn't the right place to be. I don't know how you make that easier for people, but as I said, I've had the luxury of not having to worry too much about it, and something always did come along. I don't think I'm particularly any more special than anybody else. So, I think that's available to all of us, especially in a university. That's one of the really great places about a university. I've had so many careers inside the university. And so I could stay within it and never really lose interest. There aren't too many places like that. Anything else? Questions? Stuart?
Do you think the university's gonna stay the same for a while?
No, because universities never have stayed the same for a while. People outside the university look at university and say, oh, that must be a wonderful static place, you know, where all the ivy halls and all the other stuff. It's pandemonium and chaos, and it's in a constant state of evolution and fight internally. It's just everybody on the outside, it looks calm and, you know, what a wonderful place to work. Well, if you can't live with chaos, it's not too wonderful. But I don't know what that says about all of us, but at any rate, no, it's in a constant state of evolving. You know, numbers go up and down, they have to change. We're pulling programs out, putting programs in. You know, just it's just in constant movement. You know, you'd sort of look at this and say, you know, what's the likelihood of this thing surviving this long, and think it probably wasn't too great, but, you know, obviously it is. So I think to a large degree, it's because we have so many minds engaged in it with such variability between our people. And we haven't managed to cut them out so that we make the decisions too narrowly. So, you know, I remember Dean Haynes telling me when I came over here, you had to be careful listening to Dean. Okay. But he said, this is a wonderful place. Said at Michigan State, you can innovate anything. It's unimaginable. Of course, you can't implement anything, but you can innovate anything. There is a certain amount of truth to that. Okay. So maybe I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you for talking. I wanted to, on behalf of the students, present you with a little token of
Oh,
your
thank you.
recognition of all your contributions to learning and career development and professionalism, and just thank you again for coming to speak to us.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed it.